With the Marvel Vs Capcom collection finally here, the entire FGC can barely contain their excitement. Or their speculations. Could this mean a new Marvel Vs Capcom is possible now? For months, fans have been throwing out their dream rosters for a new Marvel Vs Capcom game. And considering we have a show on this channel all about coming up with hypothetical fighting game rosters, feels like that's something that I should really take a crack at. Problem is, I already did it. Yeah, we came up with our idea for a new Marvel vs. Capcom game on our very first episode of Build the Roster. That being said, do not watch that episode. It was our first Build the Roster and my editing skills were crap back then, and also in those 5 years, that roster has become wildly outdated. Remember when we all thought Capcom was about to bring back Mega Man? Those were some good years of denial. My point is, that video could definitely use an update, and I will get to it someday, but not today. Because today, I'm not going to look at the entire Marvel universe. No, instead, I'm going to act like Marvel Comics back in the 90s and ignore all the other books out there except for one. And we're going to build the roster for a brand new X-Men fighting game. X-Men, welcome to die! Welcome to a brand new episode of Build the Roster, the show where we take a hypothetical fighting game and build our dream roster around it. And I know all year long people have had Marvel vs. Capcom on the brain, and you know me, I do love the Versus series. I love the idea of taking heroes and villains from every corner of these rich, vibrant worlds and bringing them together. But you know, I can't help but get a bit nostalgic for the days when, if you wanted to make a comic book fighting game, you didn't have to bring the entire universe together. I miss back when you could give a fighting game to just a single team. Not that one. That one. Yeah, there was a time when the X-Men didn't just have their own fighting game, they had a lot of them. Children of the Atom, Mutant Academy, that third one that I'm forgetting. They had so many X-Men fighting games, I don't even remember them all. So as much as I want another Marvel vs. Capcom, and believe me, I do want another Marvel vs. Capcom, if Marvel said, hey, we're getting back into the fighting game scene, I'd be down for a straight up X-Men fighting game. And it feels like the perfect time to do that. Everywhere I look, I see people saying that they are sick and tired of Marvel. Everyone is done with Marvel now. Nobody wants anything to do with Marvel Comics. Except for Marvel Rivals, that thing actually looks really darn cool. And people seem excited for that new Thunderbolts movie. Also, I heard some good stuff about Agatha all along. And I can't lie, that new Captain America film looks dope. Okay, look, people are very split on Marvel right now. Except for the X-Men. Everyone seemed to be all in on the X-Men once again. Everyone's favorite mutants are back in the spotlight and they are exploding. Their latest movie raked in huge cash. Their new cartoon is one of the most critically acclaimed shows of the year. And their comics just spent the last 5 years being some of the most applauded books on the market. The X-Men are back on top in a way that they haven't been for almost 3 decades. So I say we keep that ball rolling and give them a brand new fighting game. And today, we're going to build the roster for it. But before we begin, we have to figure out the roster size. Well, the first X-Men fighting game was Children of the Atom, which was a Capcom game, and Capcom's latest fighting game, Street Fighter VI, had 18 characters at launch. However, the only other big superhero-based fighting game that we have seen in recent years was the Injustice franchise, and the first Injustice game launched with 24 characters. So, halfway between 18 and 24 is 21, so that's our roster size. Huh. That's weird. Normally when I do these rosters, I include something that make them far more complicated, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen today, and oh no, wait, here it comes. Yes, folks, if you've been here a while, then you know that I can never just come up with a roster size. I need to give myself some kind of a unique challenge. Otherwise, this is just a video of me listing off 21 characters that I like. So, challenge number 1. As I said, the first X-Men fighting game was Children of the Atom, and one thing that I love about that game is that the roster was split right down the middle between heroes and villains. It had an even amount on both sides. So today, I'm going to attempt to do that again, which is going to be really complicated because A, we have 21 characters, which is not an even number, and B, because if you've been reading the comics, we are currently living in the post-Krakoa era of the X-Men, where the line between heroes and villains is very blurry. Professor X is in jail now and everyone hates him. Pyro is a hero now. The Beast turned evil, but then they killed him, and now there's a clone of Beast before he turned evil as the new Beast. Juggernaut is on the hero's side. Doug Ramsey is now the new Apocalypse, which is something that I'm sure will change everything forever and be very important and not completely undone in like 5 years like it never happened. Comics are fun, everybody. My point is, I'm going to pick 10 heroes, 10 villains, and one remaining kind of in the middle character, a sort of morally gray individual. But just remember, any characters on the heroes or villain side may or may not have been on the other side at some point in history. I'm just going to go with what they are more traditionally known as. Basically, if you ask somebody who wasn't a die-hard comics fan, but still knew these characters and enjoyed them, this is where they would probably put those characters. But that's just the first rule. The second and third rule, and arguably the most challenging rules, the rules that are going to make this roster look really confusing to anyone who just skips right to the end of the video. Listen, X-Men fans, I love you, you're great, but you're kind of stuck in the 90s. And that's coming from a guy whose channel has arcade in the title. Yeah, X-Men nostalgia is stronger than any other comic fan base I've ever met. It's so strong that some of you might be shocked to learn Marvel kept making X-Men books after 1999. In fact, they made a lot of them, with tons of new characters, and a lot of them were really good. So here are the other two rules that I have for today's episode. Out of these 21 characters, 10 of them have to be characters who have never been playable in a fighting game before. At least, not in a traditional fighting game. Yes, I know Marvel has a couple of mobile fighting games that have like hundreds of characters in them, but yeah, sorry, I'm not counting them. And the other rule is that 5 of these characters have to be characters who were created after the 90s. Whatever the next X-Men game is, it needs to include a handful of new faces, so you know what? Let's go ahead and set an example for that today. Also, real talk, if you're Marvel, you want to include some characters in your game who nobody outside of the comic book fan base has heard of, because that will get them interested in learning more about these characters. And if you don't think that's true, these were the top trending pages on the Marvel Wiki site the week after Marvel Rivals came out. Yeah, putting brand new characters into your game gets people talking about those characters. This stuff works. Okay, we got our roster size, we got our rules. Time to put on our yellow spandex, board the Blackbird, and resurrect Jean Grey for the 5th or 6th time as we build the roster for a brand new X-Men fighting game.
To me, my X-Men.
Okay, let's not be around the bush on this one. Normally I like to go one by one with these character reveals, but these to me are the 3 no-brainers who need to be in every X-Men fighting game. Like, they're so obvious, there's no tension to this reveal. You all saw them coming. Wolverine is easily the most popular mutant Marvel has ever made. Heck, there was a time when Marvel had him on like 5 different team books at a single time. Then I'd say Storm is another standout character who has been one of the biggest faces of the X-Men over the past 40 years now. Plus, if you're a fighting game fan, you know Storm kind of has an important legacy to the Marvel games. And lastly, Cyclops, the original X-Man, the most consistent leader of the team, the character who has fought his entire life for Charles Xavier's dream. Except for that time he decided to let the Phoenix Force possess him, and he ended up killing Xavier, but that was like 3 reboots ago, and I'm pretty sure Bendis wrote it, so yeah, don't worry, nobody counts it. Also, for years now, I know a lot of people who don't read the comics have kind of been hating on Cyclops. They see him as being really plain and boring. But thanks to that new X-Men cartoon, people are finally starting to understand Cyclops is actually pretty dope. People actually like Scott Summers now. That's something I haven't been able to say since, I don't know, the 70s? So yes, we have to include Cyclops as well. And each of these 3 characters would have pretty clear fighting styles. Storm is a zoner, but she'd be a zoner with tons of maneuverability. Even if this isn't a high-speed game like the Versus series, Storm would still have air dashes and be able to zip all over the screen. Cyclops would also be a zoner, but he'd be far more ground-based. His maneuverability would be kinda low. But he is skilled in hand-to-hand combat, so basically he'd be a zoner who wouldn't be that fast, making it kind of easy to get in on him, but he'd still have a couple of moves that would allow him to deal with you in close combat. And Wolverine? Yeah, we all know Wolverine. He is a rush-down wreck-a-fighter. He runs in, and he starts attacking, and he keeps attacking. Once he starts slashing, it's kinda hard to stop him. Maybe we could give him a unique berserker meter that fills up as he takes damage. Then when it's charged, he would get some kind of a boost for a limited amount of time, like his specials would have armor on them, or he could link together attacks that wouldn't work before. As I said, pretty clear-cut selection here. These are characters that we all know why they need to be in here. We all know how they'd fight, so let's move on to the next fighter. Magneto. Another super obvious choice, but I want to get him out of the way now because remember how I said this cast would be 10 heroes, 10 villains, and then 1 character right in the middle? Yeah, let's go ahead and check that box off because I'm pretty sure everyone already knew who I was talking about. I can't think of any other character in comics who over their lifetime has walked the line between hero and villain as much as Magneto. This man has attempted to wipe out mankind multiple times, but he's also been one of the greatest champions of mutants and has even gone on to be a hero for the very humans he's tried to destroy. In fact, at the time of this recording, he's been fighting on the side of the X-Men for probably 20 years now. Yeah, he's been a hero almost as long as he's been a villain. That being said, he does occasionally backslide from time to time. Listen, supervillainy is a hell of a drug. You can't kick it all at once. So yes, Magneto does fit nicely into that 21st spot, but even if I didn't have this rule about heroes and villains and 1 in-between character, he would absolutely have to be in this roster because he is one of the most important characters to not just the X-Men, but to the entire history of comics. He has to be in here. Juggernaut. Okay, with Magneto now in here, that means 75% of the characters we have in this roster so far are zoners, and thinking about that is making me break out in a cold sweat. So let's include the polar opposite of the zoner, the tank. And you don't get much tankier than Colossus. But I already put this roster together, and there's sadly just no room for him. So instead, we're throwing in Juggernaut. Not only is Juggernaut a fan favorite for anyone who grew up with the X-Men in the 90s, or with internet memes in the 2000s, but also the developers of the last 2 Versus games tried to get him into those titles, but they couldn't because of the whole Disney-Fox feud. But that's been resolved now, so let's make up for lost time. Bring on Juggernaut as the big massive tank character. He's slow and he's got huge openings that can be easily punished, but those attacks hit like a truck and all his specials are loaded with armor, allowing him to close in on his opponents. Heck, you could even give him a super move called Nothing Stops the Juggernaut where he just gets to power through everything for a limited amount of time. Also, I know someone is going to say the Juggernaut should be another one of those in-the-middle characters since he's currently on the X-Men in the comics and he's even been a good guy multiple times over the past decade. But unlike Magneto, I think most people still think of him as a villain. So we can have him on the bad guy's side one more time. If this game ever gets a sequel and he's still a good guy by then, yeah, then we can talk. Sabretooth. Going to stick with the villain side for now since I threw 3 heroes at you at once, so let's go with Sabretooth. He's one of the most savage villains in Marvel's history. He's so bad, when the mutants all founded their own nation of Krakoa, they gave every mutant a clean slate, forgiving all their previous crimes. And yet, Sabretooth was still so bad that within like 2 days, they still had to banish him to Eternal Super Jail. Even guys like Apocalypse and Mr. Sinister looked at him and were like, dude, you gotta go. Plus, you got Wolverine in here. Put Sabretooth in here and you know those two would have a great pre-fight interaction. And just like Wolverine, he'd be a rushdown character with plenty of slashes and leaps that can get him across the stage in the blink of an eye. And since he is bigger than Wolverine, he'd be a little bit stronger and he'd have a little bit better range on his normal attacks, but those normals would be a little bit slower than Logan's to help balance him out. Omega Red. One more villain before swapping back to the hero side. I'm going with Omega Red, simply because we got zoners, we got rushdown, but we still don't have a grappler. Sure, we have a tank, and many tanks are grapplers, but not always, and that wouldn't be the case for Juggernaut. So we still need to fill that slot, and who better to be our grappler than the guy whose superpower is wrapping you up and squeezing the life out of you. The Omega Red would use his carbonadium tentacles to reach out and grab the opponent and toss them around, or use his mutant powers to suck the life out of them and heal himself. Although we might want to save that as a super move or an EX move. These days, if you have a grappler who can reach out and grab someone across the stage, giving them a normal special move that also heals them might be a bit of a broken combination. He would fight kinda like Birdie from Street Fighter with his chain, although with a bit more mobility. Also, side note, I've been reading comics for about 30 years now. I didn't know until right this second that the metal in his tentacles was called carbonadium, and I think that might be the new winner for silliest sounding fake metal. Rogue and Gambit. Back to the hero side, and we got another group pick here. We need to include Rogue and Gambit. Not only are the two of them a package deal, but also I'd say out of all the X-Men out there, these two probably have the most nostalgia power. Seriously, if you only watched the cartoons or read the comics from the 90s, you probably think these two are like the biggest X-Men in existence. And why would you not? Rogue and Gambit are just flat out cool. Even people who have never heard of the X-Men take one look at these characters and go, yeah, those guys are badass. The super strong Southern Belle and the smooth talking Cajun Thief, these two are so cool you could sell this game on them alone. And as for how they'd fight, Gambit is a great addition because he is our first all-rounder. He's got projectiles with his cards, he's got combos with his staff, he's got a good grab attack where he can charge you up. He's a jack-of-all-trades type of character. And as for Rogue, you know she would be a powerhouse, but the most important thing about how Rogue would play, she would give this game some flash, some pizzazz, something that makes people talk, something that people would want to see in combat, because we would bring back her power from the original Street Fighter vs. X-Men game, where she could copy the power of whoever she touches. I used to think something like that might be too much to include in a modern-day game with everything you would have to do to make it work. But then Street Fighter V gave Seth that exact power, and it worked great. People loved that about Seth in that game. So yeah, we absolutely have to bring that back in here. Psylocke. I said that Rogue and Gambit have a ton of nostalgia for the 90s kids out there, but if there is one character who can beat them for that slot, it's Psylocke. This purple-haired ninja was huge back in the day. I'm pretty sure that if you read X-Men comics back in the 90s, about 50% of what you remember about them is Jim Lee's Psylocke, and the other 50% is Magneto ripping out Wolverine's bones. And her appeal goes beyond the comics. You might have heard me bring up the Versus games and Children of Atom plenty of times in this video, and fans of those early games were all about Psylocke. Players loved her in those titles, so if we're going to try and reignite an X-Men fighting game franchise, she would be a good pick to include. And she's a ninja, so her playstyle would mostly focus around her agility, making her a good, lighter, quicker character. Although there's one last thing that I have to say about this, even though this won't affect her gameplay in any way, for story or lore purposes or whatever you want to call it, I would suggest that we make this version of Psylocke Quanon instead of Betsy Braddock. Betsy is Captain Britain right now in the comics, she's doing just fine. Let's let Quanon get some time in the spotlight as the main Psylocke. Or you know what, just avoid all possible confusion and ignore Canon altogether and make it Psy from the Demon Day comics. That's the version they put in Marvel Rivals and everyone seems to be okay with that, and that is easily the sickest Psylocke design we have ever gotten. Mystique. One of the most popular and well-known X-Men villains, I always found it shocking that she wasn't in the original Children of the Atom or in any of the later Versus games. Now, her mutant power is shapeshifting, and we would certainly scatter that around her moveset here and there. We could use it in her big Cinemac Level 3 Super where she transforms into various characters as she beats you up, and we can give her a few special moves where she transforms, or maybe even one super where she just flat out turns into her opponent for a limited amount of time. But most of her playstyle would come from the fact that she's a very agile and skilled gunman and a hand-to-hand fighter. So she'd have plenty of projectiles with a variety of weapons and some flips and dips to help her jump around her opponent and get away from them whenever she needs to make some distance. Now, I said that Mystique wasn't in the original Children of the Atom. But remember, my rule for this episode wasn't that half the characters couldn't have been in the original Children of the Atom. No, I said they couldn't have been in any X-Men fighter. And Mystique was in the Mutant Academy and Next Dimension games. But she is the last returning character in this roster. Everyone else is brand new. Sort of. Apocalypse. Yeah, I bet some of you might be shocked to see the big guy here so early on this list. Heck, some of you might be shocked to see him here at all. If there is any X-Men villain who feels fit to be the final boss, it's Apocalypse. In fact, he has been the final boss in X-Men fighting games before. But that's one of the big reasons why I wanted to include him on the main roster. This is one of the most popular X-Men villains ever, but he has never once been playable in a single fighting game. So, if we want this game to really grab those X-Men fans and make them pay attention, telling them, hey guys, guess what? You can finally play as Apocalypse would definitely get them interested. As for how he'd play, Apocalypse is one of the strongest mutants on Earth, and thanks to his unique powers, he's kind of a Swiss Army knife. Whatever he needs to do, he can do it. So I say we make him a cross between an all-rounder and a tank. He's strong, hits hard, has a variety of projectiles and other moves that would be good for various situations, but Apocalypse doesn't really move that fast. Don't get me wrong, he could totally move fast if he wanted to, but he rarely does. Apocalypse is more typically seen just standing there, menacingly, so that would be his weakness. He's a massive powerhouse, but you could find ways to outmaneuver him. Now, Apocalypse is our first brand new character into this roster because yes, he was a final boss in the previous Versus games, but as I said, they had to have been a playable character in the previous games. And Apocalypse has never been playable. Except in the Game Boy Color version of X-Men Mutant Academy, but you know what? I said I wasn't going to count mobile games. Game Boy Color was a mobile console, so you know what? Doesn't count either. Yes, I admit my rules are stupid, but they're consistently stupid. You gotta give me that. Emma Frost. If we're going to include one new X-Men in this game, Emma Frost is at the top of that list. She'd been a hero guy in the Generation X team back in the 90s, but in the early 2000s during Grant Morrison's run, she officially joined the main X team. And over the past 20 years, she has continued to be one of the main faces for the X-Men. Non-stop, no breaks. Do you know how rare it is that a character gets added to an established team and they don't get dropped when the new writer comes on? That is insane, and it just speaks to how popular this character is. Now, as for how she would fight, well, first off, Emma Frost is loaded with attitude, so make sure that each of her attacks are full of personality. I'm talking Karine Kanzuki levels of don't you know who I am attitude. But for her actual fighting style, there's two ways that you can go with this. Emma Frost is a high-level telepath, so we could give her plenty of projectile blast or mental moves where she takes control of the enemy, but she has another power. the ability to turn herself into unbreakable diamonds, making her practically unstoppable. Except that she can't use her mental powers when she's in this form. So either we focus entirely on her telepathic powers, and she has a super where she temporarily goes into her diamond form and she has armor on everything, or we could make her a stance fighter, where she can swap back and forth between the diamond form and her telepathic form. So she basically goes back and forth between being a zoner and a tank. Now, you might think that sounds like a lot for a character, but it's Emma Frost. If there's any character who screams, "I deserve all the moves because I'm just better than you," it's her. No, seriously, that's pretty much her catchphrase. Mr. Sinister. This ghastly mad scientist has been a thorn in the side of the X-Men for a long time. Heck, depending on who's writing the story, he's been pulling the strings behind the scenes since the very start. And because of that, I feel like he needs to finally be in a fighting game. But also, just like with Emma Frost, he is loaded with personality. If you haven't read the comics in a while, you might remember Sinister as being a guy who was just, well, sinister. He was just your typical cackling supervillain. But over the past decade, he has gotten one of the biggest rebrandings in X-Men history. Thanks largely to Karen Gillian and Jonathan Hickman, Mr. Sinister went from being a generic mysterious bad guy to being the most snarky, pompous, fabulous madman ever. In the past, Mr. Sinister was mad like Dr. Frankenstein was mad. Now he's mad like the Mad Hatter is mad. And who doesn't want to see a character like that in a fighting game? The personality alone would make him an amazing inclusion. I need to see this guy have a kick where he shoves the opponent off of him and tells them not to touch his cape. Although as for his actual playstyle, that's kind of a tough call, simply because since Mr. Sinister has spent generations genetically experimenting on himself, we could do pretty much anything with him and it would make sense. So, if this guy wants to keep experimenting on himself, I say we turn him into a walking cocktail. Let him inject himself throughout the match with various stimulants that can temporarily boost his speed or strength or give him brand new moves or different combo potentials. And these buffs would all be temporary, unless you do an EX version of them or a super version, in which case those buffs would last for longer, and you could stack them or mix and match them, essentially allowing you to turn Mr. Sinister into a walking roguelike where every single game you could give yourself a completely different build. He would either be the worst character in the game or the most broken. But also, for a more out there idea, let him summon out his clones to run in there and tackle the opponent or stand in there to block for him. Because if there was one person who Sinister would gladly throw out there to take a bullet for him, it's himself. And you know what? Speaking of Mr. Sinister, Mother Righteous. Alright, as I said, we're currently in the characters who have never been playable in a fighting game before part of this roster, but as I said, 5 of these fighters have to be characters created after 1999 in order to try and update the face of the X-Men. But even by new character standards, 1999, 25 years ago, is a low bar to clear. That is not that new. I would say a third of the people watching this weren't even born 25 years ago. We need at least one really new character. Someone created within the last few years. That character who makes the people reading the comics feel rewarded, like, aha, I know that character. And out of all the villains introduced recently, I'm going to have to go with Mother Righteous. Long story short, you know how we always thought Mr. Sinister was this scientist named Nathaniel Essex? Well, it was revealed that he was actually a clone of Essex. And he's not the only one. Over 100 years ago, Essex created 4 clones to each pursue one area of expertise, and each of them had a different card suit on their forehead. Mr. Sinister's area of expertise was genetics, and Mother Righteous, who was actually a clone of Essex's late wife, specialized in magic. She's one of the most powerful sorcerers in the Marvel Universe, and sure, she's got energy blasts that could give her some good range attacks, but she's mostly known for being a master manipulator, able to trick others into being loyal to her or able to take a tiny bit of their power for herself. So we could give her some counter moves that leave the opponent weakened or end up sucking away some of their life or super meter to replenish her own, or maybe she could even have a move where she summons in a character she's tricked into servitude. I'm basing my idea for this game off of the Versus game, seeing as how that entire franchise began with an X-Men game. And you know what other game was heavily inspired by the Versus games? Dragon Ball FighterZ. And in that game there was a character named Baby who, if he defeated one of your 3 characters, he could then summon that character back in as an assist. Do the exact same thing with Mother Righteous. If she defeats one of your characters, she has now tricked them into fighting alongside her. I will be the first to admit Mother Righteous has a very weird power set that might seem hard to interpret into a fighting game, but trust me, there are definitely ways that you could do it. Armor. Another character for the created within the last 25 years column, Armor was first introduced in the massively successful Astonishing X-Men series in the early 2000s. She was a student at the X-Men school, and every few years a new writer comes onto the X-Men and they come up with a dozen new students. But unfortunately, very few of these characters stick around. Not because they aren't popular, far from it. A lot of new students end up developing big fan bases during their runs. I personally love the new X-Men characters from the early 2000s. Surge, Rockslide, Elixir, Mercury. God, that series was so good, and I love those characters. Sure hope none of them died while I was writing this script. It's the X-Men, death doesn't mean anything. What am I saying? It's comics. Nothing means anything. Anyway, as I said, new writers keep coming onto the X-Men books and they want to make brand new characters. But we can't exactly retire the older characters, so what you essentially end up with is brand new characters getting created, while the original characters remain, and those previous new characters now find themselves in this weird awkward spot in the middle where there just really isn't room for them anymore. So a lot of them end up getting dropped. You'll be lucky if you create 10 brand new characters for the X-Men, and one of them continues to stick around for a few books down the road. And Armor is one of those characters. She's continued to be a fairly important face for the X-Men for roughly 20 years now, continuously popping up in brand new titles, big events. Heck, at the time of this recording, she's the star of the Peach Momoko Ultimate X-Men series. And yet, despite all this, if you don't read the comics, you probably have no idea who I'm talking about, because she hasn't been in really anything outside the books. She wasn't even in any of the Fox X-Men films, and those things scraped the bottom of the barrel looking for random characters they could include. So let's correct that and finally put her in a game. And if you can't tell from her name and her power to create a massive suit of armor around her, she's another tank character. I figure the villains got one, it's only fair that the heroes got one too. But Armor can manipulate her, well, armor, to turn to different shapes and sizes. So she wouldn't hit as hard as the Juggernaut, but she could shift around to give her more range and mobility. And since one of her favorite techniques is to grab her opponent with those giant armored gloves of hers, let's make sure to give her a command grab. Omega Red shouldn't be the only fighter to have one. Basically, if it's a typical big character trait for a fighting game character, Armor would have it. Gorgon. This is another one of those characters who first appeared around 20 years ago and hasn't just managed to stick around, he's kind of become a big deal. Partly for how insane his backstory is. He was a mutant with the power to turn people to stone, hence the name, but he was also a super genius who came to hate the idea of God, and so as a teenager he formed a death cult and then joined up with Hydra, where he got a sword called God Killer, which could do exactly what the name implied. Quick question, why is this guy an X-Men villain? Shouldn't he be going up against like Thor or something? Well, he actually became a big villain for Wolverine, and honestly, even if his backstory wasn't over-the-top nuts, I'd still be arguing for him to be in this game because a master swordsman with the power to paralyze people just feels perfect for a fighting game. I mean, imagine if NetherRealm made this new game. He'd basically be Kenshi, but with Sub-Zero freezing powers. The moveset writes itself. By the way, I wrote that line right before the news story broke that Warner Brothers didn't want NetherRealm to make anything other than Mortal Kombat. RIP Injustice, and almost everything else that is made by Warner Brothers. Alright, Alright, we got two good guys left for this game, both of whom have to be characters who have never been in a fighting game, and one of whom has to have been invented within the past 25 years. And for that particular spot, I can't lie, it was kind of tough. As I said, a lot of brand new characters keep getting created for the X-Men, and then a lot of them end up getting forgotten about as soon as the next writer comes on because they want to create their own brand new characters. Which is very understandable, but it does mean that a lot of these brand new characters don't stick around for that long. Sure, there are exceptions, but out of those exceptions, not a ton of them really felt right for this game. Like, Hope Summers is a big important character. She's one of the most important brand new X-Men created within the last 25 years. But she has the power to take the abilities of any other mutant that she wants, making it really difficult to figure out how she would play in a fighting game. Then Quentin Quire has been a huge continuous character, but I also need to sell these characters to people who haven't been reading the books. And let's just say, I am not prepared to explain why a guy who looks like Punk Buddy Holly in jorts is actually cool. Timber has continued to be a big deal, and just recently she ended up joining Cyclops' X-Men team, so her star is still rising. But she has the powers of fire and ice, meaning she'd probably be another zoner, and this game is teetering on the edge of having too many zoners. Even our grappler has ranged attacks in this game. But then I remembered, we're missing something in this roster. And if you know this show, you know what I'm talking about. We're missing the weird pick. And boy, are there a lot of good choices for the weird pick. The X-Men are nothing but weird picks. So you want to get weird? Let's get weird. I'm going with Rasputin 4. Rasputin 4 was a clone created by Mr. Sinister in the future to be a conqueror, only for her programming to be undone, and then she traveled to the past to stop Sinister before he could destroy the future. If you are shocked by anything I just said, you don't know the X-Men. They have like 20 screwed up futures, so we should probably include somebody from one of them. And as for her powers, she's got the Soul Sword of Magic, the Armor Skin of Colossus, and like 3 other powers, but the important thing is she would be a big slow fighter who swings a giant sword around. I've been comparing this hypothetical game to the Versus series, and looking at Rasputin 4, I am immediately picturing how Monster Hunter fought in MVCI. Just a character who, even though they don't really have any projectiles, their weapon still fills up massive chunks of the screen. And their swings might be slow, but when they hit, they do so much damage, it's worth it. Nimrod. We have to throw a Sentinel in here somewhere. They're way too important to the history of X-Men, way too recognizable, and when it comes to fighting games, they've kind of left their giant footprint all over the genre. But because of that, I had a problem. Sentinels have been in fighting games before. Lots of them. And because of my rules that everybody loves and never cause any controversy or arguing in the comments, I couldn't put any of the old characters in here. Luckily, there's more than one breed of Sentinel. So I'm going to go with Nimrod, who is a Sentinel of the future sent back in time to wipe out the mutants. Yeah, I figured we got Rasputin 4 in here to be Arnold from Terminator 2. Why not include Arnold from Terminator 1? And despite having existed ever since the 80s, Nimrod hasn't actually shown up in a lot of games. However, as I have said many times, I want this game to feel like it was made in the modern day. I don't want it to just be the X-Men's greatest hits. I want all the people who have been reading the comics to pick this thing up and say, yeah, that character. And if you've been reading the X-Men over the past 5 years, Nimrod has been kind of a big deal. He was one of the big threats that kicked off the whole Krakoa age. He was one of the leaders of Orchis, the big new villain group that dismantled the X-Men, and is responsible for one of the most dramatic, jaw-dropping moments in X-Men history. I don't even know if I can show that page on screen and still monetize this video. So yeah, if we need somebody on here to represent the Sentinels, my current #1 pick has to be Nimrod. And when it comes to their playstyle, Nimrod is a high-tech machine designed to take out thousands of different opponents. No matter who he's going up against, he's got something prepared for them. So I say, make Nimrod, for lack of a better term, a tricky style character. That character who has an answer to everything, but they are the most high execution character imaginable. When you select that character, it says ease of use, and that rating is in the negative numbers. 95% of people are going to think this character sucks and he's low tier, but that 5% who actually know how to play him are going to be unstoppable. In other words, he's the character that you need a Dominion level IQ to actually play, which feels appropriate. Dazzler. And for the final X-Men on the list, I want someone who was a fan favorite and had been around for a while, but they rarely ever get that chance to shine, despite shining being one of her main powers. I will admit I was really leaning towards Jubilee in the final spot, since she was a voice for a lot of young fans back in the 90s, thanks to her being that new young character on the team, as well as being in the animated series. But again, that animated series has done a lot of heavy lifting for the X-Men. There were characters from before and after that show who could definitely fit into this final spot. And not only has Dazzler remained an important face for the X-Men for decades now, but she's also got some nostalgia behind her thanks to her being one of the playable characters in that old X-Men arcade game. Which, now that we got the Versus games back, is the new Marvel game that I will be arguing needs a re-release and constantly pestering the developers until they give in. Plus, just like Emma Frost and so many other characters on this list, she's got a little something extra to bring to this game. Personality. Dazzler is a musical superstar whose mutant power is she can turn sound into light. So of course she could use her energy projectiles to give her some good ranged attacks, but we could also give her some moves that lean to her musical background, like she does a quick dance step and suddenly some musical notes appear around her that can act as a shield, almost like her band is off screen and they're playing for her. Or give her a power-up where for a limited amount of time her moves are stronger, but while this buff is activated, she has her own theme music playing. Kinda like Kimberly in Street Fighter 6 or Yang in BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle, and I apologize because I just got the I Burn song stuck in all of your heads right now. And for her big cinematic level 3 super move, you know it would have to be an entire dance number in front of a giant cheering crowd. That's why even though there are so many other X-Men who absolutely deserve a spot in this roster, I still had to go with Dazzler. Because she doesn't just have the power set to bring to this game, she's got personality, and fighting games, as I have said so many times, need personality. Annihilation. And now we come to our final villain, and again, going by the rules, they have to be a character created in this century, but there's something else that we need from this final character. A boss. Yes, for the boss of this game, I was tempted to go with something classic like Dark Phoenix, or go with someone who we've seen before like Apocalypse or Magneto or Bastion, but no. I love the idea of the boss of a comic book game reflecting the most recent era of those books. I remember when I played through Marvel Vs. Capcom for the very first time, and then suddenly Onslaught popped up, and I thought, wait, they actually include the big new guy from the comics! He hasn't been in any of the cartoons yet! They got someone to work on this game who actually read the books! And I want to include a boss in here who could possibly get that same reaction. So when it comes to the most recent X-Men books, the two big villain groups were Orcus, but we already got Nimrod in here to represent them, and a giant, omniscient super intelligence that stretched across space and time, and yeah, it was a little bit confusing, and I'll be honest with you, it's not the type of character who would fit all that well into a fighting game. So instead, let's look back to the big storyline right before this, and that was an event called X of Swords, which revealed that Apocalypse had a wife, Genesis, who ages ago led her children, the original 4 horsemen, into another dimension to fight off an invading army of demons. She fought off their leader and won, only for their leader to reveal that they were actually being possessed by a mask called Annihilation, and if someone ever beat Annihilation's host, they would now become possessed by Annihilation. And so, Genesis became possessed by this mask, corrupting her and making her continue to invade Earth. And this whole storyline of X of Swords, this battle between the X-Men and Annihilation's army, was framed as a tournament. And this is a fighting game. If there is any modern-day X-Men villain who should be the boss of a fighting game, it's the one who canonically has been the final boss of a tournament. Plus, I can see her being a pretty good match for another recent fighting game boss. I say we have Genesis fight in her normal form for most of the match, being a very skilled combatant with her sword, but she has a bar that fills up as she attacks or takes damage. And when it's full, the Annihilation mask takes her over, and now for a limited amount of time, she can fire out Big Energy Blast, Her weapon swings have longer range. She can even have a super where she summons out the 4 horsemen or some big eldritch monster to attack for her. But that's how she would fight as a character. As the boss of the game, she would fight in annihilation mode the entire time. Yes, I will admit, I am totally taking this idea straight from how Nago Ryuki fights in Guilty Gear Strive. But hey, what can I say? Sometimes a concept just falls into your lap and it works. And there is your complete roster for a brand new X-Men fighting game. Annihilation, Apocalypse, Armor, Cyclops, Dazzler, Emma Frost, Gambit, Gorgon, Juggernaut, Magneto, Mr. Sinister, Mother Righteous, Mystique, Nimrod, Omega Red, Psylocke, Rasputin 4, Rogue, Sabretooth, Storm, and Wolverine. A healthy chunk of old classics everyone wants, and a good dose of newer characters to make the game feel fresh, make it feel like it actually reflects the books and not just the cartoons and movies that most people know. But when you're dealing with a franchise like the X-Men, it's impossible to include everyone that you want in just the base roster. Heck, it's impossible to include everyone you want in the base roster in about 10 years of DLC. There's too many characters that people love, too many potential weird and interesting picks, too many old staples and new faces. But let's see if we can help fill in at least a few of those gaps when we move on to the DLC. Alright, for the DLC I'm going to go with 5 spots. I used to go with 6 in these rosters, but over the past few years I've definitely noticed most games are moving down to 4. And I get that as time goes on and games get bigger and graphics get more intense and budgets get more bloated. Yeah, it just takes longer to make these characters, but I'm not willing to go down to 4 just yet. I think we can still fit 5 in a season and be fine. And for the DLC, no rules. Anyone's on the table, hero, villain, doesn't matter. Can be from any time period, new or old, we're just here to try and make some fun and interesting additions. And you don't get much more fun and interesting than Deadpool. I know a lot of people would argue he should be in the main roster because he's so popular, but real talk, Deadpool, despite coming from the X-Men comics, despite having several movies that are closely tied to the X-Men, isn't really connected to the X-Men all that much in the comics. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's definitely involved with them. Heck, he was on one of the best runs of X-Force. But he's just as likely to team up with Spider-Man or Captain America as he is to team up with Marvel's Merry Mutants. Heck, his longest running partner and supporting character is an Avengers villain. So yeah, that's why I didn't put Deadpool in the starting roster. I wanted to be full of characters who were 100% associated with the X-Men, and Deadpool is kind of all over the place. But we're in the DLC now, which means that we can throw in here anyone that we want. Next up, Laura Kinney, another super popular character and one who has built up her own supporting characters and rogues gallery. Laura has become a huge character for Marvel with tons of growth and great storylines. So why wasn't she in the starting roster? Simple, because when you think about how many X-Men are out there, and then you realize that you only have room for 10 of them in here, that means those spots were very limited, and I'm sorry, but when spots are that small, I can't justify putting 2 Wolverines in here. But again, we're in DLC, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Also, while she is a clone of Wolverine and she would have some similarities to him, being very rushdowny, she would be far more agile, more jumping and flipping around, very assassin-like, so they wouldn't play exactly the same. Next, let's throw the classic Sentinels in here. Like I said, I'm putting Nimrod on the main roster to get some variety, and because they were far more relevant in the recent comics. But I know a lot of fans are not going to be happy until they get their big flying purple mutant hunter in here. And as I said before, the classic Sentinel has a long history of being important in fighting games, so it would be a big deal to include them, and it would get people paying attention to the DLC. Also, I've always believed that the main roster is where you set the rules for your game, and then the DLC is when you get to start breaking those rules. So if we come in here and say, hey, Juggernaut is the biggest character in this game, you can then come into the DLC and go, yeah, well now we're going even bigger. Then let's throw Magic in here. She's been a member of the team since she joined the New Mutants back in the 80s, but it wasn't until about 10 years ago that suddenly she started to blow up. She's been front and center in almost every X-Men title over the past decade, and she's even been popping up in a ton of games lately. Her star is on the rise, so let's take advantage of that. And I know you might be thinking, wait, but you put Rasputin 4 in here. Both of them use the Soul Sword. Yeah, but I also put Laura Kinney in here who also uses claws. Doesn't mean she would fight like Logan, and the same thing can be said for Magic. She'd be way quicker than Rasputin with far more mobility options. But to balance that out, she would have much lower defense. And as for her moveset, she'd be able to summon out demons, hellfire, she could even go into her Darkshot form to get a boost for a limited amount of time. Trust me, her having the same sword as Rasputin wouldn't be a problem. Although it could lead to a pretty cool pre-fight dialogue exchange. And the final character for the season, Jean Grey. Now, I will admit this isn't the most exciting pick, but she is one of the original X-Men, has been a central focus of multiple storylines thanks to her connection to the Phoenix Force, and she's got that nostalgia factor thanks to the animated series, the movies, the game. She's kind of been all over the place. But here's the big reason why I wanted to include Jean. I mentioned that these days most DLC seasons are lowering the number of characters that they're including, and part of that has to do with how much work goes into every single one of these characters. But it's also because many fighting games now include bonus materials every single season. Tekken and Mortal Kombat have new story modes, Street Fighter has brand new World Tour content. So if you're making a new season of DLC these days, you need a bit more than just characters. Well, I don't think you need a whole new story mode, but KOF started introducing new boss characters each season. And I kinda love this idea. So let's put Jean Grey in here as the final character of the season, and then we'll throw in a special bonus boss fight that you can unlock, where you'll have to go up against the Dark Phoenix. Which would basically just be Jean, except that her speed and strength and projectiles would be ramped up through the roof. Listen, you all saw Dark Phoenix in Marvel Vs Capcom 3. That character was so busted, there was no way that we could include her in this game as a playable character. But normal Jean being a playable character, and then we take that super busted form and we make it a separate boss fight, yeah, I can see that. So there's 5 characters and a bonus new secret boss fight. That is a hefty, solid season. But if we made an X-Men fighting game, listen, I got no clue how far it could go. The last Marvel fighting game barely scraped out 1 season of DLC. But Marvel games ain't the same that they used to be a couple years ago. So I'd be willing to bet if this game got made, we could at least get 2 seasons of DLC. So let's close today's episode out with 1 more season. First character of season 2, Nightcrawler. The Blue Elf is one of my favorite X-Men. Do you know how hard it was for me to keep him off this roster until now? Well, I can't hold him back anymore. We've got to throw him in here now or never. Give him some good long pokes with his rapier sword that he can combo into long strings, but they wouldn't do a ton of damage. But when you combine them with his teleporting powers, he would be a very tricky character, able to hit you from all sides, forcing you to pay close attention and know where he could possibly be coming from. He would be the ultimate mix-up character. Next up, going to throw Cable in there. Yeah, if we're talking X-Men who are important to fighting games, I remember everyone playing the heck out of this guy in Marvel Vs. Capcom 2. If there was anyone still holding out at this point, looking at this game thinking, man, where are the X-Men I remember? Who are all these new characters? I think Cable would help to finally bring them in. And yes, Cable has a lot of different powers, but end of the day, when you think of Cable, you think of big futuristic guns. So his playstyle is a lot of projectiles, but not that fast. Carrying around a giant future energy weapon that is half the size of your body is not going to make you that mobile. Then let's throw a newer character in here. I mentioned her earlier, let's go ahead and include Temper. She's one of the few X characters introduced in the last 25 years to actually stick around, and we've seen her character grow and develop over multiple titles. Going from being one of the first New Mutants created after they were all wiped out on M-Day, to being mentored by Wolverine over in his X-Men title, to now officially joining Cyclops' team. She hasn't just stuck around over the past couple years, she's definitely been an important character for the X-Men books. Plus she uses ice and fire powers, which means that we could give her a solid variety of attacks with different effects that can hit all over the screen. I know I said I didn't put her in the main roster because I was afraid that we were getting too many zoners in this game, but we're in the DLC now, forget balancing the game, just go for fun. So that's 3 heroes so far this season, we need some more villains. But we also need another weird pick. Nightcrawler, Cable, they're pretty standard right down the middle choices. Temper, yeah, if you haven't been reading the books you might not know them, but if you have been reading the books, it makes sense, you can see her being in this game. We need another weirdo, a character who nobody sees coming. And I'll be totally honest with you, I had another character in this spot, but I was out having dinner with some friends a few nights ago, mentioned I was working on an X-Men builder roster, and one of them actually said, I hope you include Sauron as the weird pick. And I actually stopped and realized, oh my god, that is the perfect weird pick. So shout out to that friend, and I hope they enjoy this inclusion. Now, Sauron isn't really a weird pick because of his power set, it's more because he's, a walking, talking Pteranodon. You include this guy in your DLC, and it will get 2 reactions: a spit take or hell yeah. The only problem with Sauron is it means we can't tease this season with silhouettes, he'd be a dead giveaway. Also, we could give him a really unique moveset. Sauron is an energy vampire who grows stronger by absorbing the life force of other characters. Just like a Pteranodon. You weren't there, you can't prove they didn't do that. And I will admit, we already got a couple of other characters who are kinda similar to that. Rogue can steal moves from people, Omega Red can recharge his life, Mother Righteous can recharge her super meter. But with Sauron, when he absorbs the life force of someone, it causes him to get physically stronger and mutate further. So maybe we could give Sauron 3 different stages of power, and you give him a move that would suck the life force out of the opponent, and that's how you would increase these stages. And at each stage, he grows faster and stronger. Maybe he could even unlock different special moves when he goes up a level. Make him a character who feels kinda weak and awkward in stage 1, then he feels pretty standard and right down the middle in stage 2, and then if you get him a stage 3, he becomes the most incredibly busted character in the game. In fact, if you want to include another new boss fight for this season, Sauron constantly at stage 3 wouldn't be a bad choice. It would be a weird choice, but again, we like the weird choices on Build the Roster. However, he wouldn't be the final character of the season. No, for that final spot, we need another villain, and I want another one we've never seen in a fighting game before. And I know this is going to feel like a mistake. I can already feel it in my bones, but it wouldn't be a Build the Roster unless I did something I would regret. So for this final character, I'm going with Madeline Pryor. I know people are going to argue against this one because last season ended with Jean Grey, and now this one is going to end with evil Jean Grey, but not the Dark Phoenix, a totally different evil Jean Grey. Madeline Pryor was a clone of Jean Grey created by Mr. Sinister, a lot of that going around. And I think she's a great character, but Marvel never uses her in anything, is what I originally wrote in this script. Fun fact about the making of this episode, I mentioned I feel that old X-Men cartoon does way too much heavy lifting for the X-Men, and I wanted to make sure that people out there got to see characters who weren't just in that old series. So I decided I wasn't going to watch X-Men 97 until I was done making this video. But now that I have gone and watched X-Men 97, imagine my surprise when 3 episodes in, Madeline Pryor pops up. Full Hellfire powers and all. Well, you know what? Screw it. That just means that general audiences now know who she is, so I feel double certain she should be in this roster. Madeline Pryor is the Goblin Queen, the Lord of Limbo. She rules over a realm full of demons and can even resurrect the dead. So she would be a summon fighter, someone who calls on minions to run out across the stage and attack. Imagine her sending in flying demons to attack from the sky while crawling monsters skitter across the ground. She'd be kind of like the modern day version of Blackheart from the old Versus games, which would also make her another great choice for the boss character of this season. Imagine you unlock the boss fight against Madeline Pryor, and in that fight, the game is now just randomly sending her demons out whenever it feels like it without her having to actually summon them. If there's a character out there who should have a soul-crushing boss fight, it's the character who rules over demons. Also, we include Magic in the previous season of DLC, and she spent a lot of time in Limbo and learned how to summon out demons. And for this season, we have Madeline Pryor in here, who is the Lord of Limbo and also summons out demons. Maybe we could title this season pass X-Men Inferno, as reference to that old storyline, and maybe include in here some brand new arcade mode where we give every character a brand new ending based on some Inferno demon-style storyline. I know I said that you don't need to include brand new story modes for every season of your DLC, but you know what? I do kind of like the idea of every season pass giving you a brand new boss fight and every character getting a brand new arcade ending. Those don't seem that hard to pull off. You just get a couple bits of art, you slap them together, and bam, you got a brand new arcade ending, and it gives everyone a reason to go back through and play the game again, even if you aren't interested in going online. But that's it, a brand new X-Men fighting game with 2 seasons of DLC, a whole new collection of heroes and villains combining both old faces and new stars. Could this game actually get made one day? Honestly, I wouldn't have thought so a year ago, but Marvel is actually doing some interesting stuff with their games, so you know what? Screw it. stranger things have happened, and the X-Men are the strangest heroes of all. So let me know who you would want to see in a brand new X-Men fighting game in the comments down below, or you can find me on Blue Sky at Thorgy's Arcade. And if you want more from us, then you can pitch in and help this channel out like the fine folks whose names you're seeing up on screen now by going to our Patreon, which you can find the link for in the description down below. There you can get early looks at videos and bonus content. For example, people at the higher tier last month got a video of me trying to put this roster together, so they got to see my mind melt in real time. So yeah, we couldn't fit Jean Grey in here, put evil Jean Grey in here, because we need a spot on the villain side. Boom, done. I know someone's gonna say, evil Jean Grey, just make it Phoenix. What if Phoenix was the final boss? Oh my god, I'm legit rethinking this now. Yeah, needless to say, it was a long process. But hey, even if you don't want to sign up, I still appreciate everyone who tuned in today, and especially everyone who shares these videos around the web. It really does help us out. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy out there this winter, and let's try and make the next year even better. Come back next time.